there's like this huge gap between having an idea and running a company.
Yes.
Huge, right? And I think that a lot of people will at some point in their life probably maybe think, I want to run this company, or I want to start a business. And sort of the space that you need to fill to get there, even just to get started, is so big.
Yeah.
And I will say it is much smaller in the US than I think it is in Europe, just because we as a country do make it pretty easy to start a business. But it is a pretty sort of staggering mountain to climb when you decide to actually go into it. And so it turned out to be incredibly difficult, incredibly rewarding, but incredibly difficult.
Can your pets inspire you and shape the direction of your career? How can practicing abroad open doors? And what personal and professional lessons can you draw from training for, I think it's important to note, and also completing an Ironman? Today, for this episode of The Abstract, I am joined by Tim Hirsch, who is the General Counsel of Mars Science and Diagnostics, a division of Mars Petcare. He was previously the GC and head of business development for Kinship, another division of Mars Petcare, which included a technology company, a $100 million venture fund, and a startup accelerator. Pretty cool stuff, I think, that we'll also talk about. Before Mars, he was the GC of Counsel. He has a little bit of an entrepreneurial bent or background. He was a co-founder of DoggyChef, which was a D2C dog food company here in New York City. And then earlier in his career, he had a couple other in-house roles, head of legal at Collibra, and I believe the first lawyer there as well, VP and senior counsel for public and private partnerships at Mastercard. And as we'll talk about too, you started your career working at a few notable law firms in Brussels, Paris, and then finally New York City. So, Tim, thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
Thanks for having me. That was a mouthful.
Well, it's an interesting background and fits with the sort of, we were talking about the theme before we get going of the podcast. Fits with the, like, we want people on who've had winding careers,
That's
done
right.
things different, not just a linear line.
No.
Okay, fun question for you to start. Most guests get a hard question, but you get a fun one.
I like it.
You seem to have a love of pets.
Yep.
Do you have a dog? Do you have a cat? Do you have other
We have a dog.
pets?
We have a dog. We have a 12-year-old Cavapoo. His name is Peanut.
Cute. Oh, that's a good name.
It is a good name. It was, we always joke with my wife, it was our first kid. We got him early in the relationship. The stories diverge as to whether it was a gift or not and a surprise or not. I always say that I surprised her with the pup for her birthday and that she wanted a pet. And she always says that, it was just me going out on the whim and getting a dog. So we'll never know for sure, but we do have a dog. It's been a great part of our life.
One of those stories is more favorable to you, though.
That's exactly right. Yes. I tell the story of how, I went out and got this for her birthday.
Yes.
She just said you just showed up with a dog. But, either way, it turned out, being a good thing for us.
And do your kids love the dog as well?
Kids love the dog. Yeah.
They didn't have to beg you for one.
They did not have to beg us for one, which was definitely a bonus for them. They grew up with it. So, they were always around him, especially, my son is a COVID baby.
Oh, okay.
Just turned 5. So, he essentially spent the first 2 years of his life inside trapped with, his parents, his sister and a dog. So he's really comfortable around dogs, but they love him. They love him. He's always been a part of the family and brings a ton of energy into the house.
We are going to come back to pets because it features somewhat prominently in a couple of aspects of your career. But you started your legal career in Europe.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about how that came about.
Well, I grew up in Europe. So I was born and raised in Brussels, Belgium, and went through high school there. Then I left to go to university and abroad in a couple of countries, and then came to the States for the first time a long time ago now, but to get my LLM, and I did that on a Fulbright scholarship. And the way that works is you sort of got to go back to your home country for 2 years to sort of preach to the rest of the world how great America is, which sounded much better then than it does today.
Yeah.
But it sort of, it's a cultural exchange program, essentially, right? So I went out there, and so part of the contract is you got to go back and work for 2 years in your home country. Okay. And so I ended up going back to Brussels, and sort of the way that, my education was set up is I ended up passing the bar in New York, and I never went to law school in Belgium, right? And so that created sort of this weird situation for me because I couldn't really practice in a traditional Belgian law practice.
Interesting.
Because I knew nothing about Belgian law.
Yeah.
But I needed to be in Belgium. And so sort of what was the natural option for me was to go and work for an international law firm and do antitrust, which is sort of, the main hub for that is in Belgium. So I sort of fell into it a little bit by accident, and sort of ended up being the start of a long journey.
I think it's interesting that you grew up there and then came to the US for law school and then went back. I mean, I think a lot of times American lawyers even have trouble maybe navigating some of the cultural aspects of European law or the focus on regulation, or there's just a very different lens on it, a very, very different view of, in antitrust too, the role that government should play. Was that ever challenging for you? Like, did you feel like you were sort of caught between these two perspectives? How did you navigate that, I guess, is my question. Yeah,
it's a good question. I think it was more of a shock when I came back here to work versus when I ended up in Brussels to work. Because, I do think that law school prepares you maybe not that well for the realities of working as an attorney in a firm. And so, it all sort of felt pretty theoretical right up until the time that I ended up starting work. I think that part of the interesting challenge of working in antitrust in Brussels is that, you mostly deal with the European Commission, which is sort of, huge behemoth when it comes to regulation. And so, that was a little bit of a shock. Just in and of itself, not in comparison to anything else necessarily. It's a big machine. But it was super fun. But I didn't necessarily feel that I was better equipped or than others or not as well equipped as those that, for example, went to law school in Europe before I ended up there. So what I think it did provide me a little bit more is maybe the sense of perspective and broader context, especially never having studied in Belgium myself. But it also sort of led to me feeling a little lost at times as well, right? Because you end up working in this country. It's weird, right? I was born there, raised there, I end up working there, and I feel like I know nothing about the legal system,
right?
Which I didn't. I knew nothing about it, and so in a way, you feel a little bit lost. I felt a little bit lost in that. But the antitrust sort of European law community in Brussels is mostly international as well, right? It's pan-European. It's lots of folks from all around Europe and the US that end up converging there. And so in a way, it's pretty cosmopolitan and very international. So felt great in that little group, but it was sort of a strange dynamic at first.
Do you feel like even today, I mean, you've worked for a variety of now very global companies. You bring a slightly different perspective to things than maybe folks who've went to law school in California and then have practiced in New York for their entire career, having the benefit of having practiced a few different places.
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah.
Right? I hope so. I don't really think about it that much anymore, right? I mean, I've been now working in the States for 15 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I spent more of my career working here than I have working anywhere else. But that being said, I do think that it hopefully shaped a little bit, the way that I think and the way that I approach problems. I do think there are fundamental differences between just generally how lawyers are perceived, even just, in the States versus in Europe. The way that the lawyers are trained here versus in Europe, the way that you practice, right, is very different. I went to university in the UK, and, even then there's like multiple different ways to be a lawyer, right?
Sure.
Whether you're a barrister or a solicitor. And so, I do think that having had the chance, and it's maybe not so much to have studied, in these different places, but having lived in different places,
right,
and being exposed to different cultures, certainly helps me navigate Mars, right, which is a highly multicultural, super matricized, very large organization with presence in most countries in the world. So I do think that I have sort of a natural ability to connect with people that are maybe not just naturally comfortable in sort of the corporate American culture. Sure. But maybe it's easier for others to tell whether that's true or not, right? That's my perception. But I certainly think that it adds to my perspective.
Super matricized. I like that. I'm going to use that. Steal that.
Yeah. It's sort of the way that I describe it.
Yeah.
It's it's a huge organization. I'm sure we'll get back to it, but just have a ton of layers that intersect, and that's really the only way to run an organization that big. But you just have a ton of touch points with people all over the world.
When we were preparing for this, one of the inflection points that we talked about in your career was that head of legal role, the first lawyer role at Collibra. Can you tell us a little bit about how they found you found them, that got started?
Yeah. Again, it's the world is a very big place, but it's not. Right. Collibra is now, $5 billion unicorn in the data software space, massive company. Yeah. When I got in touch with them, they were very small, right? So they're a Belgian company. So they were founded by a couple of researchers in university in Flanders in Belgium. And they were really doing stuff around pure sort of data, right? And really research driven. And like a lot of great inventions sort of stumbled into turning that into a business. Right. At a time I was working in Mastercard and maybe not necessarily yet able to navigate a pretty corporate in-house environment. And it turns out that, the recruiter there somehow knew people that I knew and reached out to me and said, hey, you're here, but you're Belgian and you speak a couple of languages. And, we're a very small company and we're from Belgium and we're in a WeWork at, 25 Broadway. But we really think that there's a there and, we'd love to talk to you. And, next thing you know, I was working there in a very small WeWork at 25 Broadway. Sharing office space with the sales team. And it was a transformative experience for me for sure in terms of my career and even just overall my development. I think that it was the first time where I felt that I could have an impact. It was the first time that I felt I could really screw up. Right, in a major way, which I think is often the case in very small companies, or at least at startups that are really early stage, where sort of a mistake can have a huge cost. Sure. I think it was a lot of luck that I ended up in that job. A little bit sort of talking my way into the role. Maybe overselling a little bit my abilities with SaaS agreements and NDAs at the time.
But, NDAs are easy.
NDA here, NDA there. But talk about cultural difference between the U.S. and Europe, right? I mean, not a thing in Europe, or much less of a thing back then, at least, right? It just ended up being a crazy journey, going through multiple rounds of funding and exponential growth, and now they're huge.
I think with those sort of early legal hires, let's say the first lawyer or the first head of legal or VP of legal at a company at that stage. One piece is financing that you're talking about in that growth. The other piece is sort of commercialization, getting the product really ready to go to market. The folks who make it sort of the next level with the business generally have a very good business sense. Do you feel like you learned that on the job? How did you try to do that actively?
Yeah.
Because then when I look at the rest of your career, it seems like there's a very strong through line of, hey, I'm not just a lawyer here. I'm also someone who's bringing a sort of like business perspective to the table.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So going back, I think for me personally, I ended up going to law school because I didn't want to do math, right? Essentially, like a lot of lawyers. And
I was not good at calculus either. So
there you go. And the reason I'm saying that is because I don't think that I was naturally driven, to a legal career because that was my passion. Right. I know a lot of folks that, ever since they were 10 years old, they wanted to be attorneys and they wanted to practice, and they could tell you already, I want to be a litigator, or I want to do, IP. Like, that was never really the case for me. And, it's a huge luxury to have been able to go through that process, even without that fire and that passion originally. But the reason that I'm saying that is because I always sort of felt that maybe my greatest skill was not necessarily to be a just straightforward attorney, because I don't think that I was naturally gifted at it, to be honest. Right. Then you go to law school and you see in your class, right, it's a group of folks that are just amazing. Right? Yeah. They read, they understand, they dissect, they just have a natural ability to just explain these concepts in a way that I didn't feel I ever had in law school, right? And I wasn't a terrible student, but I wasn't top of the class.
Sure.
And I think that mostly stemmed because of, the lack of just pure passion for the topic. Right. And it's not that I hated it, but I didn't feel passion for it, at least initially. It's certainly not when I was in law school. And the reason that I said that is because when I started my legal career, I didn't feel a passion for the pure legal work. Right. I always felt a lot more passionate, a lot more interest in sort of things that were tangential to the legal work. Right. And so when I worked in a law firm, I love doing deals because I love to learn about new industries and read through, SIMs and read through business plans and understand, how putting two companies together is more than just 1 + 1 = 2, right? And that I always found fascinating. And so when I ended up, working at Collibra, I loved that opportunity to just, be able to learn everything, right? Learning about software, which was the first time that I ever, was exposed to software. And, at a time it was still, SaaS was still sort of a new thing, right? A lot of the customers were still on premise. And so the model was still sort of shifting slowly from on premise to purely cloud-based, SaaS offering. And when I started, I still remember, my welcome packet from the CFO was, this binder of documents that still had, on-prem license agreement that was 100 pages, with financial institutions, like old school.
Yeah.
But I love that ability to sort of sit with the sales team and just listen to calls, right? And say, hey, this is why you need this tool. This is what it's going to do to your business. I love to be, to be sitting with the CFO and the CEO to understand how you plan on growing this company, right? What is the path to product market fit? Because it was still really early on, and we weren't sure, right? I mean, we knew there was something that was working, but it was only a handful of customers. It wasn't scaled yet, and so I think I really learned just by not talking too much, which is difficult for attorneys to do, by listening a lot, and then by just trying to be in every non-legal call that I possibly could. Right. And that was for me, sitting on all the product, team calls as much as I could, most of the sales team calls, and really just try to soak up, how do you scale a company, right? And what is the key to growing a company, particularly early on. And I think that was the first time where I felt that that I belonged, in a way, and sort of where I was working, because I felt that I could have an impact, and I felt I could, sort of take my background, which, it's never going to change. I'm always going to be a lawyer, but apply it in a very different way. And to me, that was sort of really eye-opening that was a possibility, right? Because even before at Mastercard, which was a great experience and an awesome way to go from firm to in-house, it was still much more segmented, right? It was more you're a lawyer and this is sort of what you need to do, which tends to be the case in larger corporations, certainly financial institutions. But that was sort of the first time where it was sort of a little bit free for all, right? In early stage companies. Everybody needs to do everything, and everybody needs to sort of chip in. And if you're willing to take more, they give you more, right? And so for me, that was sort of an incredible learning opportunity.
Do you feel like your time at Collibra gave you a lot more confidence when you started to think about starting your own business? Was that really formative in giving you the confidence to say, I know you didn't fully quit your job to start DoggyChef, but saying like, okay, I actually think I could lean into this and I could be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think so. I think at least it gave me maybe a false sense of confidence, right? Because we could talk about it more, but running your own company, starting your own company is so difficult. Yeah. But I certainly think that it gave me a false sense of confidence in terms of, all right, I know how to do, estate filing. I know what sales tax are. I've seen payroll. I understand these concepts from up close because, we were a really small group and I was exposed to all these topics. And I think that it gave me a sense of, okay, I've seen it. Now I can do it. Now, that was not right because those are two very different things. But I think it certainly sort of was a moment where when my co-founder called me and she said, hey, think there's an opportunity here. Do you want to do this? I felt that I had cards that I didn't have before to be able to do that. And that was certainly a moment for me where I said, okay, I can try to do this.
I mean, maybe tell us a little bit about the business, but then you've almost like preempted my next question for you, which was this as hard, like starting a company? Was it as hard or was it a lot harder than you expected?
Yeah. I think you know the answer to that now, but a lot harder, right? A lot harder.
Yeah.
And the company was, a D2C human grade fresh dog food company. And, this is 10 years ago when the market was, essentially, there was nothing on the market like that, right? And you essentially had high-end kibble or you had sort of your supermarket type of food. And then you had some fresh, with supermarket fresh food that was starting to roll in. But the sort of that trend of, what we now call the sort of the humanization of pets, right? And treating your pet sort of like your child was really in its early stages. And, my co-founder who also had a dog who was having issues with the food that she was eating, sort of started noticing this gap in the market. And, she was like, oh, there's not really stuff out there that I would want to feed my dog. And so like a lot of companies, we started it from sort of a need that we had. I was like, it's true. Like, I wish I could feed my dog something better. And so that's where it started. And we literally just started, the two of us in her apartment, just sketching something on a piece of paper to very quickly her saying, hey, we should do it. Like we should actually start a company. And, there's like this huge gap between having an idea and running a company.
Yes.
Huge, right? And I think that a lot of people will at some point in their life probably maybe think, oh, I want to run this company or I want to start a business. And sort of the space that you need to fill to get there, even just to get started, is so big. Yeah. And I will say it is much smaller in the US than I think it is in Europe, just because we as a country do make it pretty easy to start a business. But it is a pretty sort of staggering mountain to climb when you decide to actually go into it. And so it turned out to be incredibly difficult, incredibly rewarding, but incredibly difficult.
I think that fits with what you hear from a lot of other founders of businesses who've come on. It's also why when I see companies that are in stealth mode, sometimes I kind of laugh because I've had lots of ideas for businesses and I tell everybody about them and I haven't started any of them.
Right.
And so
you're running a stealth startup.
Tell us a little bit about the journey. Like,
Yeah.
did you have to go out and raise capital? Where did the business start? Where did it end?
So we bootstrapped it at the beginning, and got some friends and family money, and we essentially rented almost exclusively on that, and our ambition was to get a lot bigger. So, for a long time, it was just, my co-founder and I, her name is Deborah, if she's watching. And she was really sort of the creative, sort of operational muscle behind the company. And I was doing a lot of the sort of the more corporate-y stuff, which, not shocking.
Yeah.
We just started making food in my kitchen, in her kitchen.
Wow.
Packing meals ourselves, doing guerrilla marketing, going to dog parks and going to trade shows. And, for weekends on ends, we would set up and, go around and distribute samples in parks and wherever we could go. We did that for a long time. Then, we ended up at a revenue level where we could hire help. So we hired folks for production and for delivery. It was, pretty intense experience, going from, ideation to distribution, right? I mean, everything from, how do you make food, right? How do you package food? Where do you get, your supplies? How do you set up a distribution route? How do you set yourself up on e-com to able to manage, right? That business? How do you run a P&L? How do you run payroll? All that thing, all these things that you never really think about are involved in running a business unless and until you actually run your own business.
Right.
To me, it was probably the biggest learning experience of my career in terms of getting hands on, operational experience in running a business. And it was a crazy ride, right? I mean, we went on Seed Invest where we pitched.
Oh, cool.
In San Francisco. We grew the company. And so we ended up at sort of this inflection point where a lot of companies, I think, end up, which is either you take, substantial outside capital to grow the business, particularly D2C, particularly 10 years ago, right, which was very much an acquisition game, or you don't, and you sort of stall. And, I think we were maybe a little slow to get there because just the thought of, getting outside capital, what that entailed, I think, is daunting. And it's weird because, I had done it, on the Collibra side, and I knew that pretty well. But when it comes to yourself, it's different. Sort of it's very different, and you feel a lot more exposed. It's easy to sort of go and sell somebody else's P&L when it's loss making. It's very different when it's your P&L that's loss making, and you got to sell that, right? But we did feel pretty good about sort of the fact that business was going to get disrupted massively, right? In the way that people were going to shop for that sort of level of pet food was going to change. But we got really, I think we got delayed in getting to that realization. And then we did accelerate that, and we were negotiating with a couple of investors, and then literally, a couple of weeks before, two of the largest competitors that we had closed pretty substantial funding rounds. And sort of that cooled the mood a little bit. And so that was sort of the beginning of the end for our business. But, some good lessons there. Not the ending that I think we had hoped for. I think, looking back, I think the other big thing for me was I was doing two jobs at once. Right. And
I was going to ask you about that.
And I think that you can do that for a while. I do think that a lot of founders, often do that, right? You have your company that you're trying to run on the side. I think that for me, I was also probably a little cold feet when he came to saying, okay, I'm going to jump and do this full time. Which, looking back was probably the ideal time for me to do it, but we didn't have kids. We're living in a small apartment. It was, the sort of the pressure that you probably have when you have, a family or when you're later in your career, was not there. Right. But I don't think I was bold enough. I don't think that I was brave enough. I think that lawyers have a bias, against these type of decisions, probably in the way that we wired. And, I thought I can manage both for probably longer than I could. And that's something that I certainly have regrets over for sure. And, looking back, I feel that I probably could have done more, should have done more, decided earlier. But, these are part of lessons that you learn over time and
share with others.
And exactly. That's exactly right.
The interesting thing to me is then, at least it seems from the outside looking in, that there's kind of an obvious through line.
Yeah.
Not from your earlier work for Mastercard or the law firms or Collibra but from the startup to what you're doing today. Yeah. I mean, tell us a little bit about that journey. I mean, I don't want to totally steep over your time at Counsel, but
no. Which was great. But I mean, it is the thread, right? And my time at Counsel was great, but I ended up, sort of coming into this company and into this role in a way that felt quite organic. A recruiter at Mars reached out to me, I think probably because they saw that I'd run a pet company. And at the time they were looking for, first legal hire for this small for Mars division that was focusing on sort of innovation and technology and sort of bringing the next thing to pet care. I think it's easy to sort of look at my background and put, tech and pet together and see that was not a really...
It can't be a huge Venn diagram, right?
Exactly. I don't think it was like a million of us out there. So I feel like her LinkedIn search was probably pretty quick.
Yeah.
But, we ended up getting on the phone and so two things. One, I had that conversation and I felt that this is so obvious, right? I also ended up initially saying no because I felt that, it was not the right time and we're through COVID and I just wasn't in the mental space where I felt that I was ready for it. And the amazing thing that happened is that the CEO at the time for Kinship said, "It's all right, take your time. We'll wait." Wow. And I don't think you get too many of those in your career. And that was a little bit of a catalyst for me to say, okay, I think that if that's representative of the culture and of management and how they run, the company, maybe I need to think about it a little harder. And I did that. Ended up in probably was for me at a time, the dream job, right? Which was combining these passions that I had for, building companies for technology, for the world of pets, which by the way is a crazy world. And, you go to the pets convention, you see some crazy things. But people love their pets, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people love their cats, they love their dogs, in a very different way that they love human beings. And I do think that it's an area that has so much passion, right? And people that tend to work in the pet care space tend to be passionate. And whether it's vets or it's, people that work in the pet food business, it's just, I think it's a very emotionally charged, in a good way, industry where people just are in it because they love it. And so I ended up joining, right? I ended up joining as the first fully dedicated legal resource for Kinship. I think that for a lawyer that likes innovation, it was also sort of the best of both worlds because it was, a mandate to go and innovate and really try to bring something new to the pet space while being part of this, really, really, really big company, which, talking about protecting your downside, it's a really, really awesome way to be able to do that, right? And to have sort of the backing of such an amazing company that Mars is. I ended up taking the job and, immediately loved it, immediately loved the people, the work, sort of the freedom, went to multiple iterations of my job while at Kinship, took on some business development, some corporate development, talking about non-legal stuff. Ended up being an incredible adventure and learning a ton more, about just pet care generally, still am. But, I realized that I knew, this, and then you realize that it's that, right? And so, it ended up being, I think not a lot of times in my life do I look back and think, okay, this was meant to be.
Yeah.
This was sort of one of these moments where you look back and you're like, okay, like, there's some common sense here.
You said something earlier that I thought was interesting when you were talking about the transition from Mastercard. You said, I think, now you know how to navigate a big organization maybe better than you once did. And I raise that only because, I think people have trouble sometimes going both directions, right? Like big organization, Google, to 5-person startup, right? Yeah. I think sometimes people have trouble going the other way too, though, right? You go from an org in which your responsibilities are wide ranging and you are a lot more essential and, there aren't sort of like edicts from 6 levels up on high, right? I don't know, talk to us a little bit about that. Like, what have you learned about navigating a big organization? Why do you think you're better at that today?
Yeah, and listen, it's hard. And I think it's even hard for people that have been in large organizations their whole life.
Sure.
Right?
Small p politics.
That's exactly right. For me, I think the biggest challenge is to sort of framing your area of influence, right? And and like you mentioned, when you work in a 10 people startup, your area of influence is everything and everyone. Yeah. And it's reciprocal, right? Because everyone is in everyone's business.
Totally.
I think that the reason that people challenge to go from that to a large corporation is because they think that it's going to work the same way, right? It's good. You're going to go to a big corporation and you're going to be able to influence a million different things. And I think that the sort of one of the critical things to do is to reframe your own perception of what your area of influence should be. And it doesn't mean that you can't have influence in a very large organization. It just means that you need to influence in a different way and on different things, right? And I think for me, that was certainly, even though I had been in a large organization than a startup, it was still a learning curve, right? When I joined Mars, because no 2 organizations are the same. No 2 cultures are the same. And I did have to figure it out, right? And to sort of relearn and retrain myself. I think particularly for lawyers, it's an ego thing as well, right? I think that we like to shape as much as we can, right? And we like to impact as much as we can. When you work in a startup or certainly when you're in one lawyer legal department, you shape every legal decision because that's your job, right? Now you go into an organization that has 200 lawyers, you're not going to shape every legal decision and you're not going to touch every, legal issue. That doesn't mean that what you touch is less important, right? Or less impactful. But I do think that from an ego perspective, I think we're sort of, especially if you come from a smaller company, you're sort of naturally trained to be that person, right? And to want to sort of have a very large area of influence. And so I think part of the secret, or at least part of the recipe for me, was, one, you gotta check your ego and realize that you're not going to be in every conversation. You're not going to be in every department. You're not going to be able to influence it all. But it doesn't mean that you can't impact, right? And in a way, you can have maybe a much larger impact than a bigger company. If you're in a much bigger scale business, you just got to figure out how you can do that in a way that focuses on sort of why you're being asked to do. But it is hard. It's hard to retrain, your brain. It's hard to put your ego in check a little bit and say, this is the new normal for you. But the flip side is that it comes with a lot of amazing other things that you don't get rather than a smaller company, rather than resources and support and time often, which you often don't get in a lot of smaller companies. And so, and maybe personally, I also had maybe the easiest of transitions, which was I sort of went into the startup of the big corporation before I went into the big corporation.
Trampoline of sorts almost.
Exactly. But I think you always sort of, evolving as a person as well, right? And so it's really a matter of, I think, founding your comfort level in the new normal and accepting that it's different. And then, some people love it and then some people hate it. But, for me, it ended up being an awesome fit.
That's really interesting. I have a couple more questions for you about something that I'm really interested in. I hope my guests are too. You recently, a few months ago, 6 months ago, completed an Ironman.
Yeah, June.
In June, okay. I think you're my second guest who's done this. Okay. You're in good company because Dan Haley is the other one, and he's an amazing general counsel. What motivated you to take on a challenge like that?
I still don't know. I still don't know. So I think I am a pretty challenge-oriented person, right? Sure. And I find that if I don't have something specific to work towards, I tend to stagnate a little bit. I think I'm naturally lazy. That's sort of my default state. Yeah. And I can get out of that laziness if I have something specific to work towards. I had a couple of conversations with my wife about, wanting to do a physical challenge. I'd done some other stuff in the past, and I got injured, and then I felt like, I was stagnating a little bit fitness-wise, and I somehow started thinking about triathlon. And I have zero triathlon experience. Prior to that, I had never owned a road bike. The most that I had swam in a pool was, 2 laps on vacation. And I don't think that I'd ever run a 10K before. Right.
Wow.
So I had no right to play in that space. We often talk about the right to play and the right to win.
Yeah.
Zero right to play in triathlon. I don't think that I'm naturally, built for triathlon either. But, it sort of started, to percolate a little bit in my head. And I started talking about it, and I think it was at the end of the year, at the end of 23, my wife was like, just do it if you got to talk about it. Right. I think she called me out during a dinner. Yeah. She said, well, because I kept saying I'm training. She was like, you're not really training. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to sign up.
Yeah.
And so I signed up and paid the fee.
They're not cheap.
They're not cheap. They're not that expensive. It was like $300 or something. Yeah. But it's enough that you're like, I don't want to.
It's motivating. You don't want to miss it, I guess.
You have skin in the game. And then, realized that I sort of had to train for it. But it really all started from just wanting to challenge myself. And I do like to set sort of a objective-based performance and something that works for me, and something that I really like to anchor around, even with my team. And that's how it started, and so I went from having zero triathlon experience to doing the race. And it was an incredible journey, honestly, just super fun. Learned a lot about myself.
You can give me some tips offline. I mean,
yes,
so I see it's motivating for a half, which I think is more reasonable given my work travel schedule. I can maybe relax a little on the training, but I can imagine doing a full Ironman. Like, you have to be incredibly disciplined on the training, and it's also a lot of time. How did you find that balance? Like, how did you create the time, I think, to tackle something like that? Yeah,
it's Jenga a little bit, right? So you gotta sort of reshape your days and your weeks. My wife was super supportive. And you have to have support from within, right? And so I was incredibly lucky that she said, you can do this. Yeah. And that she gave me the time and the freedom and the money to do it. And then, it was a lot of waking up very, very early in the morning, 4:30 a.m. to go and hit the pool before the work day. It was a lot of, time early on the bike before the kids woke up. It was a lot of time my wife just, dealing with the kids so that I could go and do, a 4-hour bike ride, in the garage in the middle of winter. And so, I do think that a lot of it is the support system. A lot of it is the people that you have around you. that can really provide that space for you. And then just discipline, right? I mean, you just, the most difficult thing is to just stay very committed to the process. And I do quite a bit of travel for work. I was on the road a lot. We had vacations with the kids, and you just got to figure out a way to keep training, right? And I went on 18-mile treadmill runs at the Frankfurt Airport Sheraton. When I landed, I did laps in the pool when we went on vacation with the kids, which was great. I went on really early morning runs, in the middle of nowhere when I was traveling, just because I had to get it done. You just have to find a way, right? And I think that's probably the toughest thing is, when you have a career and when you have a family, to just not find excuses not to do it. Because I think it's easier to find a reason not to do it versus a reason to do it. But then I just fell in love with the training. I just love, I'm a sucker for repetition, and I'm a sucker for a schedule. And I'm a sucker for knowing what I'm going to do all week. And, I had a coach that was programming for me, and having that little luxury of having somebody tell me what to do and when to do it and how to do it was huge for me, and worked really well. You learn a lot through the process. And I think, with triathlon, a lot of it's a lot about the training versus the race, right? Because the race is like this, but when you train for months, really when you look at the ratio, it's a lot more training than it is racing.
For sure.
It was pretty awesome.
Maybe you've already said it, but is there like a core lesson that you feel like you took away from the whole experience?
Maybe two things. One is you got to break things in small chunks.
Totally.
And I think that really applies to work as well. I think when you think about doing 65 miles on the bike, that sounds awful.
Yep.
Right. And that sounds like you're never going to get through it. If you think about doing 10 miles 6 times in a row, all of a sudden that becomes a lot more approachable and a lot more reasonable. And that's really sort of how I approached the training on the long distances, right? It's don't think about how long you're going to be on that thing. Just, went through all the seasons of Full Swing and of F1 on Netflix. Like I watched a lot of shows, but you just do it, one episode at a time is the way that I approach it on the bike. When I had to do 4 hours on the bike, I was like, I'm going to watch 5 episodes today. And that's how you break it up, And that's something that you can really apply to work as well. When you have to write a super long memo or when you have to read a presentation that's 200 pages, break it up in 10 pages increment. And I think that brings a lot more immediate satisfaction, to our brain, which I think we crave just naturally. It also makes the task feel a lot less daunting. So I think that's number one. And then number two is, you got to work your weakness. Because I think that we all naturally tend to like to do what we're best at. And I think, for me, it was running, right? I love running. You don't need to be great to run, right? It's just a pretty simple thing. Put your shoes on, you go out. But that was my comfort zone, right? I went out and, could run, and that was not a big deal. But I very quickly realized, because I sort of was, not really investing as much time and effort into the other two, that's pretty quickly becoming a problem. And so I sort of flipped the training, and my coach was like, you need to flip the training. And so for a month, I ended up just swimming, essentially.
Wow.
Which was miserable because I'm not a good swimmer. I know you're a good swimmer, but I'm not a good swimmer. I don't have a swimmer's body. I was not naturally, drawn to the pool. And, the first time that I had to swim for more than 20 minutes, I thought, what is this? Why am I doing this to myself? And how does anyone subject themselves to something like that? I really learned a lot through that. And I think that's something you can apply, anywhere, right?
Absolutely.
Which is just focus on the stuff that you're not good at. And I think that especially as you you go through your career, I think we tend to just gravitate towards the stuff that we're the best at, the stuff that we like the most, right? Because they tend to be the same thing. You, Tim, you tend to like what you're really good at. And so, that was really sort of philosophy that helped me break through a lot of those plateaus when I was training. And that's something that I really took away from that experience.
A great reminder to our guests to listen all the way through the podcast, because some of the best advice
is at the end.
Okay, I've got a few closing questions for you that I like to ask all my guests. The first one is if you have a favorite part of your day-to-day.
It's bedtime with my kids.
Nice.
We always read a story together at night, and they're 5 and 7, and they still want my wife and I to read them stories. For parents of young kids, it's bedtime can cut both ways. It can be challenging, but it is something that the kids look forward to every day, and I think that my wife and I look forward to every day, and it's part of these things that are not going to be there forever, and it's something that I definitely love to do.
Do you have a professional pet peeve?
Yeah. For me, lack of effort. I don't mind people failing. I don't mind if you don't know something. I don't care if you need time. I mean, nothing is a no in my book. I think not trying is something that really irks me, because anyone can try, right? That doesn't mean that you will succeed,
right?
And I'm not, I don't care about success in and of itself or about the outcome, but I think lack of effort and not trying is something that really rubs me off the wrong way.
Do you have a good book that you would recommend to me and to our audience?
Yes, I recently read this book called 100 Saturdays.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah,
okay, cool.
Which,
something new.
There you go. So it's a really fascinating story of this 90-year-old woman who grew up in Rhodes, which is an island off of Greece, in the Jewish community there. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, as part of the Jewish community, which was very small, and it used to be owned by the island was part of Turkey. Then Italy invaded it in the early 1900s, and she ended up like all the other Jews on Rhodes being deported to Auschwitz, and she ended up surviving. And made her way to New York and, lived a really long life. And she met this journalist, book writer, one day. They sat down at her house on a Saturday, and it led to 100 Saturdays of them coming together to have him interview her about her life in Rhodes. Turned into this book, which is fascinating. It's an incredible sort of snapshot. She sort of goes through her life as a Jew on Rhodes, which was a really unique time that we're probably never going to see again. But this island where they went from having no electricity, no running water under the Turks, to being invaded by the Italians, and all of a sudden having this renaissance, and being very prosperous in the 1920s, to in 15 years being all essentially massacred and exterminated.
Wow.
On what was the longest journey of any Jewish population to get to Auschwitz, right? Because they went from the south of Greece to almost northwest Africa, to all the way to Poland. And it's a beautifully written book. The story, she's a beautiful storyteller, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. And it's called 100 Saturdays.
Great recommendation. Okay, final question for you. My traditional closing question for my guests. It's if you could look back on your days of being a young lawyer, just getting started, maybe getting your LLM or in Brussels, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
Yeah, and when you sent me that question, I really had to think hard because I feel like there's so much today. But I think probably the biggest thing is nothing. you know?
Little humility.
You know, and I think that, that's so, for lawyers, I think particularly, right? You come out of law school and you really think you know a lot. And you do, right? Maybe you just don't know a lot about what you need to know to be a practicing attorney. And I really wish that I realized that a lot quicker, because I think there's, this lack of humility. I think this massive confidence that we get when you get out of law school, you pass the bar, it's really hard to get to that place and you feel that you got there. But looking back now to where I was, I really wished I realized how little I knew about what it actually means to be a good attorney, at least, right? And to add value, to help a business, to sort of guide decision-making in a way that's valuable to the business. And so, having realized that a little earlier, maybe would have been beneficial, but you are your mistakes. And so wouldn't be here without those as well.
Tim, this has been really fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of The Abstract. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.
Bye.